share with you some of my work just on renewable energies. I'm going to wait till 2:30 because that's when this is actually scheduled for. But maybe you can tell me where you're from a little bit and why you're here. And I know Kelly. Why are you here? You're the back row.
I'm back row, yes. Richard has convinced me. I'm Teresa. I'm actually a faculty member in modern languages at Carnegie University.
Okay.
So I teach Latin American literature and culture and Spanish as a second language. And I'm here with 6 of my students.
Awesome.
But I love bats because of Richard.
And did you show her your cat with a little Carnegie melon with a little damselfly?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I sent that to her, and she took another one with another.
I have a collection of Richard in hats with damselflies.
Why not?
There's a montage.
Go on. Okay. And you folks.
Yeah, I'm Peter. I'm from Carnegie Mellon in statistics and trying to figure out how we can set up a study abroad.
Wow. Okay.
I'm Samantha. Same reason we're here to
Okay.
see what we can do to help folks analyze data down here.
So we have 4 people from Carnegie Mellon. Wow. Okay. And
I'm Fern. I'm the director here at the Institute and a biologist. I'm interested in bats and renewable energy, so happy to hear about all this together.
and Kelly. Just introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Kelly. I work at the Bat Jungle. I'm learning about bats. I'm very new to this world, but I'm fascinated, so I want to learn as much as I can about anything, everything.
And why don't you introduce yourself, and then we'll go over to that side.
Okay, I'm Irene. I'm the communication coordinator here at the Institute, and I love bats as well. So I'm
Thank
really
you.
excited to
Thank
be
you
here.
for helping. All right, Richard, you want to? Why don't you introduce yourself? Does everybody know who Richard is? Yes, of course. Well, I've enjoyed many coffees and chats with Richard, and we play recorder every Tuesday, most every Tuesday. Okay.
I'm Sherry, and I'm really but I'm also interested in bats and birds.
Yeah, Sherry's an ornithologist and physical therapist. And why don't, even though we had a chat, why don't you go ahead?
I'm Mariano. I'm a biologist. I'm right now and currently I'm working at CIA.
Okay, and I asked everybody to just introduce themselves.
Okay, I am Daniela. I work here at the Monterey Institute in deforestation.
And you used to work at the Bat Jungle.
Yeah. I love bats. I've always tried to get involved with bats as much as I can.
You gave us a great tour last year.
Did I?
Yes, you did. You gave a tour to my students and me last year. It was fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
Okay, and finally up in
That's
front.
another of my hats.
Joe, neighbor from here in Monteverde. I love bats. That's my
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm going to go ahead and begin. It doesn't get in. Maybe we can take the lights out.
Okay.
Turn them on. Make it a little bit darker. So I work on a lot of aspects of bat biology. I'm particularly interested in foraging ecology. I probably spent about 10 years looking at the foraging ecology of Hawaiian hoary bats and trying to figure out how we can reduce fatalities there and conserve that species. Today, I'm going to just talk about the conservation of bats and renewable energy. Let's see. Wake this up. Let's see if there we go. Okay. Wind energy is the obvious one, right? We hear so much about this. I'm surprised and a little alarmed that, you're not looking at the fatalities here in Costa Rica as much as maybe some other countries. I think it's a serious problem all over the world. I want to touch solar energy because it's it's probably the fastest growing renewable energy in at least Western US and now many other countries as they develop better ways of capturing the sun's energy. Hydroelectric, which is very important here in Costa Rica. Geothermal energy, which you also have, which is not as important worldwide. And finally, wave energy, which I will explain later that I had no idea there would be any potential impacts. And after telling the people that I really didn't have a part in this, actually in the end I did have a part. Okay, I don't need to tell you people why we need renewable energy. I will say, though, that it's not as green as we would like. And for years, people asked me, and particularly true for solar energy, they've asked me, well, Dave, tell us, is solar good or bad for the environment? And it's not like that. We need to convert to renewable energy. We can't continue using fossil fuels, obviously, because of climate change. We're going to run out of oil and so on. But these energies will change the ecology of the areas that they're being built. Some are temporary and some are permanent. But I think we need to reconcile what they're actually doing. And not just say, well, it's because we have to. Well, it's a trade-off, At what point do you adjust this equation? We're going to start out with wind, and just today, starting today, every following year, there are another 32,000 wind turbines built in the world. And this is growing at an exponential rate, so that rate is going to greatly increase. Notice I put 3 megawatts. The turbines here in Tilaran are about 1.5. These are much bigger, and they will kill many, many more bats than the 1.5, assuming that you have the same number of bats. The picture on the upper left is from Tilaran. On the right, this is one of my projects in Hawaii. Those are 1.8 megawatts. And then on the lower left is one of the earliest projects in Hawaii. They're 30 years old now, and they're actually disintegrating. And it's an eyesore because nobody wants to spend the money to dismantle them. Okay, first I want to talk about the evidence. In 2014, which is 9 years ago, there were still, 2.22 million bats estimated as the fatalities in North America. It's just one part of the world, probably the high concentration, but not much less. I don't know what the comparison is now between North America and Europe. North America almost killed wind energy program in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and Europeans picked up those industries and bought them out. And so they were able to develop those industries much more quickly in the 90s and the early 2000s. Now those same companies are operating all around the world. A paper about 5 years ago came out suggesting that because hoary bats, that's one of the foliage roosting bats, a lazuli bat, are particularly susceptible to fatalities and strikes at turbines. But in 50 years, that population is expected to decrease by 90%. That's enormous. That's as bad as for some of the species in the white nose syndrome. That's the same level. Okay, so early, let's see, this would have been 2008. Several of us were thinking about, okay, so just, why are bats and birds killed at these things? Could be any number of reasons. Robert Barkley and Paul Cryan came out with 7 hypotheses. I'm going to just mention a few of the more popular ones. One is, okay, maybe the turbines just act as simple filters. If you have big turbines wearing blenders or big fans across the landscape, is it a matter of them just taking out a certain percentage of the airspace? Okay, one hypothesis. Another very popular hypothesis, which, by the way, I rejected fairly early in the game, but nonetheless, was that bats, particularly hoary bats, look at turbines as a roost. And in fact, most of the bat fatalities occur in the early fall during migration, the heaviest time of fall migration. And you can see where, okay, maybe my parry to this is, or my question about this is that, okay, but in some of the areas that I've worked in, we're only catching males. There are no females there. If we only get male fatalities, why are they deciding to focus on the tallest tree to find a mate? It doesn't quite work out right. And it's very possible that this works in some cases. Okay. And thirdly, something that people are still arguing about, are turbine strikes associated with foraging? Is it a matter of turbines attracting insects and bats going after these higher concentrations of insects associated with those turbines? Okay, and just want to show you, I took a little clip. A bat's going to appear, follow that bat, and you'll see a strike. Honk. You see that? I'll do it again. All right, but the bat appears to be, it's flying around that turbine. It's not a matter of just flying across the landscape, right? No, it's attracted to that turbine. One of the first things I said when we were having this issue is, bats are curious. If you put a mouse trap out in the desert with nothing in it, there's a chance that you can catch gleaning bats in that mouse trap. And I think it's not because the bat thinks that that's food. It's because it's a new object. It's curious. It's checking it out. I'm talking particularly about pallid bat or Anthrazoas, which eats things like scorpions, centipedes, things that crawl on the ground that are not flying. So I think bats they tend to be curious. It's not, I think there are many reasons. There are many reasons that they get hit by turbines. Okay. Now, not only are they hit by the blades, but we now know that many bats aren't actually even hit. And either their lungs explode, the little alveoli burst, or they have such a vacuum that they implode. So if you look at this diagram, you don't have a laser pointer by any chance. I don't have one with me, so. If you look at this diagram right here, you can see that this is very low pressure. It's so low that the alveoli will implode from the vacuum. At this point, even if the bat doesn't actually hit the blade, if it comes in contact to this cone here, where it's extremely high pressure, the alveoli will burst, fill with air, and rupture. And the bat dies, right? So there are many different, what's interesting to me is that you don't get the same percentage of bats that die from barrel trauma at various sites. And it may have to do with the size of the blade and so on, the shape of the blade. Okay, so we wanted to look at some of the hypotheses for both birds and bats. And of course, I was particularly interested in bats, and that's where I'm going to present some of the results of that study. But we got a large grant from the state of California to start looking at this. This, if you don't know, is a hoary bat. Below is a Mexican free-tailed bat. Both of those are open aerial foragers. And that's important because you don't see bats that are gleaners so much. Bats that stay low or bats that prefer intimate situations, that either glean insects off foliage or are in deep forest kind of things. Those two bats, which are the most very susceptible in North America, are open area foragers. Oh, thank you so much. Mexican free-tailed bats have been observed foraging at 10,000 feet up, 3,000 meters above a substrate. Okay, so what did we do? We took two different projects, and I'm going to... Oh, perfect, okay. And we also... Okay, well, we'll do that with that. Okay, so two different projects, two different companies, each had 30 turbines. These are 1.8. And we did something different. I was worried about the number of fatalities that we would find. And for years and years, these people and various, in that particular wind energy area, would ask me why there are no bats. So how come there are no bats there? We've never found a bat. And I said, how often do you survey? And they said, well, we survey every turbine. Every turbine. And I said, no, that's not my question. My question was, how often do you survey each turbine? And the final answer was, well, we survey them every 45 days. 45 days, you're not going to find any bats or small birds because the ravens, the beetles, scavengers are going to take those, right? They're going to make use of that resource. So we surveyed with a team of 6 people every day. Whoops, got to do it this way. Okay, so we looked at correlations using general models, and we wanted to look at temporal variables. When do these happen? What were the weather variables that made sense? We used radar, we used night vision goggles, and we looked at the interactions among these. Okay, so something really interesting started showing up. So the night vision observations could only go about to the height of the turbines, right? So we could only make so many vision and so many observations. But this is what was so interesting, and that was, so there's this great, I call it the great soup. It's birds and bats and insects by the thousands upon thousands that are streaming across at night that we don't see. We're not mindful of these animals. But it's a very dense conglomeration of fauna. And what we found using radar was that nearly all of the birds and bats were well above the turbines when they're foraging, when they're migrating. Okay, so only 6% at this site and only 2% of those animals were actually within the strike range. Then we started looking at the direction And they had, so this, oops, yeah, here we go. So this was also revealing. So when the animals were below the turbine height, they went in all directions, right? There's no specific direction. But when they were above that turbine area, and we were using our radar, they had a very strong direction to them, right? They were going very directed way. Okay, and if we look at wind turbine, if we look at the wind patterns, then we can see that actually these animals move with the wind where it's strongest. And where it drops off, then I suggested that we know that the birds at least, which we know a lot more about migrations, we know that those birds are going to wind up to the southeast of this area here, based on other information. But it's interesting that they don't go against the wind here. They just go with the wind. And then as you get farther east, then they start coming down laterally to that wind. Okay. Every bat that we caught, every bat that we recovered had a full stomach. There's lots of papers out there that claim that bats don't forage when they're getting hit by a turbine. Where are they? Those papers were all written in the Midwest and in central plains of Canada, when the bat is beginning a long migration, right? They don't want to be heavy. And what I had to tell my colleagues is that, okay, y'all are saying that bats don't forage when they're hit. No, actually, it depends upon the site, because when they're leaving, they're not eating, just like birds. They leave on a pretty low stomach. Even the organs change mass. As they come in, this is the Central Bay Area is actually either a stopover area or it's actually their wintering grounds for hoary bats and some Mexican free-tailed bats. And so, as I said, every one of the bats that we recovered had full stomachs. Okay, this just shows you that each day you get about 1/2 the number of fatalities recovered. So if you just put these out and then you watch them disappear, the removal rate is very fast in the beginning of this. And Manuela Huso, who's a statistician who spent a lot of time developing models to determine or estimate the number of fatalities for a given project, said the naive estimator always underestimated fatality. Under some conditions, as much as 98% underestimating. And that is a statistician. So suffice to say that there are typically many, many more fatalities than we think. Okay, I'm going to just show you some of the modeling. We found that the highest frequency of fatalities occurred during the mid-season of the migration. Higher fatalities on warmer nights. As the altitude of this great soup that I talk about declined, more bats were hit. That's not a surprise. But this was new, and that was that when the flight direction was east-northeast to south-southeast, you had more fatalities. Okay, if we just look at Mexican free-tailed bats alone, then we saw a relationship with barometric pressure. And this coincides with a lot of other studies. And it has to do with migration. Bats are leaving. They're beginning their migration or movement. And this was a surprise. So there are more Mexican free-tailed fatalities? When the winds are stronger. That's the antithesis of hoary bats. And frequency increased as the altitude of this soup went up. I still can't explain that. Nobody else can either. But it's a strong relationship. Okay, and here, if you start looking at the landscape features, this is the direction from a tree. So here, direction to nearest eucalyptus patch, to this is a Mexican free-tailed bats. It's not as strong for the hoary bats, but there is definitely a relationship between a turbine and a eucalyptus patch of trees. Okay, let's look at this in detail here. So, one of the things we did was a GIS hotspot analysis. And so this is a geographic way of statistically showing if different spots are different or not. And so in this whole row, there were no fatalities except one right here was definitely significant with only 3, but compared to all the others, it's definitely a hot spot. And there are other 3s with the same relationship. So what's going on here? This is the direction of the wind, exactly that. And if you draw a line from this eucalyptus grove right here to this building, which was the operational center, they happen to have floodlights in the back of the building. And when I went up there one night, and this is what I took a picture of. These are moths and beetles that are flying around the lights. Bats find these, right? And so they would just habitually roost here. The next night when they want to feed, they would just make a beeline to this known site here and get nailed right here. That's not what Mexican free-tailed bats do. They have a totally different tower, but that is also a hot spot. And look, there's also a nearby, this is the same building, but something is different here. They have different biologies. In this case, we happen to know that Mexican free-tailed bats fly nearly all night. I mean, unlike hoary bats that will drop like a rock when it rains hard, they just drop, the squall goes through, and then they're up in the air again. Mexican free-tailed bats will power through things like high wind and also rain. And so here we have this canyon. A strong wind coming across here, the bats are going to go into this canyon. Why? Because there are insects there too. And presumably they are going foraging in this canyon and also to the back of this operation building and get nailed by C-21. Same story, different reason. Okay, now, about 2014, we thought, we've got to do a better job of finding the carcasses. And so we hired a woman who found whale poop with scent dogs, which is marvelous. And she did this from University of Washington, and she would put her dog in a small skiff and then go up and down in Puget Sound, and the dog could alert to the feces of one of these killer whales, which would then float to the surface. They'd go up the cone of the smell, scoop that up, and then that's what her work was on. So we wanted to do this. We weren't the first ones who thought of it. Ed Arnett had found his own dog could find carcasses, but we wanted to use this at a utility scale, something that no one had done yet. And we've done that on many projects to increase the science, right? Because when you can find more fatalities, then you know a lot more about what's going on. Okay. Now I just wanted to bring up a few other points from other studies. This is from it was from a different study later but using scent dogs. And we got some really nice data for 5 different species of bats and when they occur. And you can tell that, mid-August to mid-September is really the highest point where most bats are hit. Some other studies suggest that most fatalities, not in the case of the Mexican free-tailed bats, but particularly true for western red bats and hoary bats, most fatalities occur on low windy nights. Taller turbines kill a lot more bats, and some have argued, well, that's because they're covering more space. No, even when you correct for the greater area, taller turbines kill more bats. And then, as many of us bat biologists have said, bats don't run into buildings ordinarily. They don't run into Met towers or stationary blades. And if you think about it, people say, well, don't they have sonar? I mean, why can't they just see this? Imagine a blade coming across from the side at 250 kilometers per hour. If you're not far enough away from that, if you're close and it comes from the side, there's no way you're going to detect it. That's one reason. The second reason is because these blades are inordinately smooth. And when you echolocate against a smooth object like a glass, it's going to just bounce off and go out. You're not going to get any echo back from that. And so they perceive that as open space. So it would be very difficult for them to detect that. If they corrected for that, like the turbine or the tower itself, if they put a texture on it, then the bat would be able to see that. Okay. Number of mitigation mechanisms have been used and proposed. This is one that many people said they were trying to make this into a silver bullet. It's basically a high-frequency ghetto blaster, right? So you blast out high-frequency sounds, broad spectrum, so not just one frequency, but many high-frequency sounds, and it messes with the bat's sonar, and supposedly it's not going to be able to navigate, or orient rather, or forage. But, again, one of the things that I've suggested is that, okay, let's move this fast forward another 10 years. The issue that I see is that you're going to be constantly playing a catch-up game. As fast as you try and make something that produces enough high-frequency sound, those blades are going to be longer and longer and longer. High frequency attenuates very quickly, and you have to put out enormous energy in order to push it out. That takes energy to run. And at some point, you're kind of defeating the purpose, because you're spending so much energy on a machine that's designed to make energy, right? So I've never been particularly enamored with the acoustic deterrents. I'm not saying that they don't work. I think the best situations have been a reduction of about 35 to 40%. In some cases, they've actually attracted some species, like red bats. A far better way of looking at this is to curtail, that is, stop the turbine for a short period of time when there's some environmental reason for the bats not to get hit. And so looking at data from 202 bat detectors in Hawaii, we ran an algorithm of a couple years of data to see, if we could pull out reasons that if they stop that turbine, it would greatly reduce the bat. Now, in the case of Hawaii, it cost, I'm sorry that's not legible, but I wanted to point out that what we looked for were signatures like this, which is a temperature. So the width is the confidence interval. So this is pretty accurate. We know that there's a strong relationship between strikes and the temperature. As the temperature goes up, bats are more active and they're more hit. Something like this, is really sloppy, and it's a negative relationship. Something like this is a positive, that's wind, but holy smokes, it's just like all over the place, right? So you can't use something like that. But we found that higher turbines, the turbines that were higher in the landscape, took out more bats. So those are individual turbines that tended to kill more bats. The lower ones, closer to the ocean, were not as much. But in the end, the client decided not to exercise any of the smart curtailment right. They were going bankrupt. And so it was all moot. Didn't matter. Okay. But I really think that curtailment is probably the best way to go. That particular wind energy project could stop a turbine at a 10-minute interval. So if you got low wind, when most bats are hit, and the turbine isn't making much money, because it's going slowly, that's when most bats are hit. Low wind, slow movement, okay? And so if they increase the cut-in speed, that is the speed of wind at which they allow the turbine to start moving, if they increase that to 5 to 6 meters per second, they can reduce up to 80% of the fatalities. Those bats cost $50,000 a bat. That's what the penalty is that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service plays to the wind energy companies there, because it's an endangered species. So it's worth them paying attention to this. I wonder if we can close this door. Okay. This is a sensor-based curtailment. There are several companies that are developing these now. Basically, you have a microphone, high frequency, a bat detector, if you will, that senses the bat in close proximity, and that basically tells the computer to stop the turbine for a certain period of time. So we're still working on a lot of these systems, but they're getting better. I think the ultimate would be to have vertical turbines, because for the most part, bats are going to see this type, and they don't have the disadvantage of having this blade coming at very high speeds from the side. There's another one that I just saw pictures of that engineers are developing. I wish I had a picture of this, but it funnels the air down on each side of the turbine, but it basically looks like a big drum. You can't see the moving parts. The drum is fixed, and then each side of this has a scoop. It scoops the wind into a venturi tube. In other words, it's squeezed down to a small point, and inside there's a turbine, and the bat is only going to see the drum. And it's going to be easy for them to avoid this. Okay, come on. Let's go to solar here. The size of the new solar projects are enormous. This particular one is 5 by 7 miles, or about, let's say, 9 by 16 or something kilometers. You need a truck or a vehicle to just get from one end to the other. The size is just enormous. And there's one that's 3 times that size that wraps around this. A little intro to some of the types of solar power. So the one on the top here are tracking solar panels. They are multi-layered so that different layers of the material have different sensitivities to the light. And so normal or typical solar panels, PV panels, are only sensitive to a single frequency of light. But now we're getting multiple layers, which is much more efficient. In addition, these panels track the sun so that they try and be perpendicular to the sun rays. Both things greatly increase the productivity of that style. Okay, here we have a solar dish engine. It's hard to see from there, but that is like a big truck. So these things can be like 30 meters high. They're quite large. And they're simple dishes that then concentrate solar into a boiler, either attached here or to the side. This is a linear concentrator, which is one of the first solar projects in the world. It's in the Southern California desert. And a pipe runs in between a trough, and that water runs through the whole plant. And as it does, that water gets extremely hot, and then it runs a turbine. And then finally, the solar power tower, which I've worked on the last 5 years, the largest in the world being ISEX, or Ivanpah Solar Power System. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Probably the biggest problem in terms of issues with bats is that many of these projects just take out the top meter of soil. I mean, that just completely changes the landscape. It renders almost no biological material in this. Very destructive. Huge areas are going out. A second issue are the detention basins. Now, unfortunately, solar needs water. You need to wash those panels. The wind turbines don't need water, but in solar, you're constantly having to, not constantly, but you're periodically having to wash those things. And that basin in the desert often concentrates toxic materials. They might not be toxic in a natural setting, but when you have evaporation day after day, things like selenium, things like certain metals that are okay in smaller concentrations then become toxic to the birds and bats that might drink from this. Okay. Now, a little bit about solar panels and bats. A friend of mine, Stefan Greif, came out with this really interesting paper where he showed young bats in a room, and when they echolocated, they tried to drink off the water. Now, in nature, there's almost nothing that's completely smooth except what? Water, right? Water is flat and it's very smooth if it's still. So bats use that cue to drink. And to some degree, I think some of that is innate and some of it is learned. But you can see here how it works. The bat echolocates and the signal just goes off into space. So they had one individual that made 159 attempts to drink off this flat surface. So a lot of people were concerned. When we got to this huge solar energy thing, what we're finding was that the solar panels here acted as barriers, which then slowed wind down in these very open plains. This particular one was in the Carrizo Plain. And you get this high concentration of insects. And Johnston, for her master's, figured out that bats and insects are usually about 12 meters from the edge of a forest. And that's this curve right here. This represents 12 meters. So naturally, then bats forage, some bats forage on these insects behind this panel. At least that was what our hypothesis was. We also looked at fences, and we wondered, okay, are fences a problem? Could they stop a gleaning bat like pallid bats from actually going past this? Would they define a foraging area on one side or the other of this fence? Okay, we're going to go, wait. What? What's going on? Huh? Okay. The Wi-Fi signal didn't quite get through. All right, let's see here. All right, we're going to go quickly through this. We thought the solar arrays would affect bat activity. Bat mortality would be very low. We didn't feel like the situation that Stefan Greif and his professor came up with was common in the wild. We thought that some bats, based on Meredith Jensen's work, some bats would take advantage of these panels, and that gleaning bats might decrease because of the fences. Okay, so here's just a picture of them building this. It's located in the Carrizo Plains right here in California. Enormous, enormous project. It took 3 years to build this. Okay, and we did surveys just like they did, or just like we do for the turbines. When I met with the regulatory agencies, they said that there should be no fatalities whatsoever. And I said, why do you think so? And he said, well, there's no moving parts. I said, that's not necessarily a good reason. Actually, it wasn't the agency so much as it was the proponents, the developers. But some people, some agencies were thinking that there wouldn't be any fatalities. And I just suggested, the truth is that nobody really knows. We should just do fatality searches like we do for wind. And that's what we did. So we had control plots. We sampled various areas of these many subparts. You can see here, these are all projects. And we put 26 bat detectors. At the time, there was this big argument about whether or not full spectrum or zero crossing was better. Each has its own advantages. And I said, you know what, we're going to just use, because everybody was asking me, which system are you going to use, Dave? And I said, we're going to use them both. And then we're going to have data that we can compare. Let's just see what happens here. All right. In the end, Mexican free-tailed bats really didn't have any significant difference between outside the arrays or inside the arrays. It was just the same. Not too surprising. They can take advantage of high concentration of insects pretty quickly, but they also can forage in a lot of situations. And here we see pallid bats. It almost looks as though they are learning. So in the beginning, it was statistically, they were not entering the rays. They avoided the rays by, I think, 0.04. And but now it looks like that's 0.07, so it's not as significant. If we went back today, I wonder if they wouldn't just go over the fences. Okay, so our results. Canyon bat was the only one that really takes advantage of foraging inside the rays. And why? This is a really tiny bat. And in a plane that, has wind that's just howling night after night, for this bat to be able to come into an area that has panels that can break the wind up, that's going to be to its advantage where these insects are concentrated. Okay. Wait, what's going on here? Okay, I want to talk more specifically about the solar power tower. This was a very it was a very controversial project, and a lot of people did not want it. But there's a lot of, in my opinion, bad science associated with some of the people trying to understand what was going on. This is about 6 square miles, or maybe 10,000 hectares. Would that be about right? It's an enormous project, 6 square miles. So each one of these towers, we're going to go forward here. Okay, so I can tell you how this works. So this is about 400 feet up, and it's a big boiler that's about 100 feet by 100 feet, 30 meters by 30 meters. And these heliostats, or mirrors, which are about 2 meters, and there are 2 of them. They're 2 meters long and about a meter and a half wide, and then they come in sets. And there are over 300,000 of those. And as the sun comes up, they point the sun to this boiler. That boils a saline solution. The most productive or efficient systems are pure sodium chloride, pure salt. Because when you heat that up to 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, it can run all night long. There's so much heat in that this system can run this generator all night long, which is an enormous threat to the oil industry. Why? It's so reliable. You can have energy produced all night, not just when the wind is, not just when the sun's setting. So there are a lot of oil companies that, kind of beat me up, if you will, said some very strange things about what we were saying about this project. Okay. That sodium chloride then comes down and it runs the turbines here, and then they're cooled in these condensers, which have 15 fans. Each fan is the size of this room, about actually this distance. So wider than this, about 30 feet. So almost 10 meters. And there are 15 of those. Why is that significant? Come on. Okay. At that condenser, you have, this is the opening for one of these fans. And the only place that bats regularly were killed were in the fans. And they would often fly around the tower, which produces flux, which is an important part of this. But they would warm up. But that wasn't what was killing them. What was killing them is when it got light, then they would go into these fans. I tried to get the manufacturer to put more screening on these. They wouldn't do it because that was more drag and they wouldn't guarantee their motors. So what I had them do is put a simple ghetto blaster, high frequency, broad spectrum, that would broadcast in enough area that I could put one of those in the corner of 4 of these fans. We went from about 3 or 4 bat fatalities a week to none. Very simple. I mean, it costs, a few $1,000s for all of them. That's nothing compared to, what it has cost to reduce bat fatalities for wind turbines. Okay, this is where I think we should put our solar panels, not utility scale. I wrote a paper with 2 colleagues at UC Davis, and it's about the issue of land conversion. Enormous areas are being converted to solar utility scale power plants. And like I've told people who ask me, is solar good or bad? No, it's not like that. It will change things. And for that paper, I wrote a section called Winners and Losers. Because there's some mammals that definitely benefit. The endangered kit fox, for example, can go into a solar project that has fencing, and it can go through a slot about this big if the fence is made like that. Coyotes cannot. Coyotes prey and eat kit foxes. All of a sudden you have an area where, kit foxes and the endangered giant kangaroo rat are thriving. Other species like mourning doves preen at those areas, and the other animals eat them. So mourning doves are taking a hit, but they just produce more. So not all bad, but then there are other animals like birds in particular. Most songbirds, raptors, hit the heliostats and also hit PV panels by pretty big numbers. Bats, not so much, but birds are taking a big hit. Okay, we're going to go quickly through here. So, as I said, there's really, very few bat fatalities, none at these photovoltaic projects. And we didn't see any evidence that they, kept trying to drink off them. And as far as the bats' activity, I already mentioned that canyon bats use this as good foraging areas, but the other bats weren't really affected. And I mentioned acoustic deterrence. So in the end, in terms of bats, I think solar power is much friendlier to bats. But again, because of land conversion, we should have these things, we should have solar panels on the sides of our house, on the roofs, on the driveways, any surface that is otherwise a hard surface. This utility scale project also has to deliver this power hundreds and hundreds of miles in some cases, which creates a whole other set of environmental problems. Okay, very quickly, hydroelectric energy. This plant is over 100 years old, and I know you have some very old plants here in Costa Rica. You wouldn't think there are any issues for bats. But in fact, if you look inside one of these, then there are fans that cool off generators and other things. I counted 255 dead bats, in one tiny little area here. Why? Because they hadn't screened off areas where these bats were looking to roost. And it was just a one-way trap. The bats would come in, go through the fan, and then they would just pile up on the other side of the room. Another issue at hydroelectric are these tunnels. It's okay during most of the time, but when they flush things out once a year, or if they have a big release, you're going to flush out whatever is in there. And these take many, many forms. For the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir that delivers water to San Francisco, I designed flaps that allow the water to come out, but keep the bats out. even though it was really nice habitat, you know, those bats would be just flushed out. And in some cases, these were sensitive bats, like Townsend's bigger bats is protected. This is one of your projects here in Costa Rica. Not sure how old it is, but it's, you know, looks fairly old. But again, a lot of these spillways and tunnels can be an issue because they're not used regularly, and bats are typically not kept out of them. It's interesting. It creates new habitat for some bats, like the flat water, but that's also taken habitat away from other species, right? Okay, and only recently, this is a brand new paper that came out this year. It's about the effects of bats at a geothermal area here in Costa Rica. And what they found was that the border area of this had a very high activity. A lot of bats, several species, were using this area here that didn't otherwise. So they increased activity and they increased diversity. But you would expect that anytime you take out a certain part of the forest, right? So yes, it increased activity, but not because it's a geothermal area, it's because this now is an open area, right? But it's interesting, and as I said, you know, think of it as change, not necessarily bad or good. Okay, and finally, wave energy. Now these people, this is Oregon State University, Corvallis, Oregon. These people got a hold of me and they asked me to be part of their project, and I said, you know, you're not going to have any issues with buoys, and they were worried that the bats would hit buoys as they migrated offshore. And I explained to them why that wasn't an issue. In the end, they convinced me to just stand by and be part of the project. And eventually, they had to bring all these lines. This is 6 miles. And these waves that start this time of year are about 10 meters. And they go all summer. 10-meter waves that are coming in off the coast of Oregon. So it's an incredible source of energy if you can harness it. They have various different floats that are capturing the energy off these waves. And then the electricity is then carried onshore, underground, and it pumps up and they make a substation here. And it was only when they showed me the substation that I said, you know what? You might need me. Because when I finally made a visit and I looked at where they were going to put their substation, it was in a forest. It didn't have very big trees, but the trees had a lot of exfoliating bark. Bark was peeling off. And so I said, let's just see if you have bats or not, and we'll figure out some kind of mitigation. This project had lots and lots of eyes. It had the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, it had State Fish and Game, it had Audubon Society, and a lot of conservation groups, mostly concentrated on issues from the ocean. I put the bat detectors out. These are the various different species. So we have a spike, 2 species spike right early in the evening. What does that tell you? Anybody studies bats. When you have a big number very early in the evening, it should tell you there's probably a roost, and it could be a maternity roost, because there are a lot of bats in a short period of time, 11 bats that just, you know, boom, come out right away. And then it's quiet here, and then you see some spikes here. In this case, this is Minos humanensis. They're coming back to their roost, right? It's interesting, the California Minos has 2 spikes here. I'm not sure why, but it looks like they came back in two groups. Okay, so what did we do with that information? They were too close to the station. And this project is like a huge project with many tens of millions of dollars. I don't know what the budget is. The budget for that solar power tower that I showed you, $2.2 billion. Serious money. Okay. What I've done in the past to allow some project to move forward and yet protect the bats is I've modeled the attenuation of each frequency of sound based on 10 kilohertz levels. Okay? So how do we do that? I put bat detectors out at 20 feet, 40 feet, 80 feet, doubling that space, actually 10, 20, 40, and 80 feet. Or you could use meters, but you want to double that. And then you can see here, these are the attenuations of each of these frequencies. And so you decide how far away you need the bats from the equipment or the equipment from the bats to come up with your answer. Okay, and so based on those curves, then I came up with this chart for a buffer zone for different kinds of equipment and different activities. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service accepted this in Oregon, as did the state fish and game, and now the California State Fish and Game has accepted some of these distances for, science-based buffer zones. But there's an enormous amount of information out on decibels and how much sound a piece of equipment makes. It's all based on human hearing. 1 decibel is the lowest amount of sound that an average human can hear. And then each successive decibel is the increase that we can detect. We're not going to be able to detect, a half decibel difference. But all this information that is available is all human-based. It has nothing to do with the animals that we often use those sound levels for. And so when people explained to me what the decibel levels were for these various pieces of equipment, I said, it doesn't matter, right? It has no bearing. For another project, I found that big brown bats were not disturbed with chainsaws 60 feet away or 20 meters, or big graders. Why? Because it was such a low frequency that the bat didn't hear it. That species, and they're fairly low frequency at about 20 kilohertz, is their most sensitive hearing frequency. So it has to be based on real information and what the bat detects. And bats are different. They have very different sensitivities to sound. Okay. I want to thank you all. If you want to contact me, my email address is down at the bottom left there. And again, there are a lot of things that I could have probably talked about today, but because wind energy is going to be a very big thing here, I have friends that have asked me to weigh in on the project here at Tilaran, and you're going to see more wind and more solar, and somehow we need to get the government or the agencies to realize that they need to pay more attention to what that's doing, especially to bats. Thank you. Questions out there? Maybe someone can turn the lights on, although we don't really need them. Yes, Richard.
Dave, I don't know if anyone has actually thought about this, but there's got to be pretty strong selective pressure against those bats that are getting killed, as opposed to bats that don't fly out there and not into the place.
Right.
What's going on?
It depends upon the impact, but in the case of wind energy, it is highly selective for open aerial forages. I'm really curious what's going on here in the tropics. There's been very little work done. I know Manny at University of San Juan did some work at wind turbines with his students, and he found Artivius geomensis was fairly commonly hit. I would have never thought Jamaican fruit-eating bat would be at risk, but he found quite a few of them. Maybe they're going from one roosting area to a feeding area. I have no idea. But open aerial foragers are particularly at risk. And yes, Fred Fricks, and it's actually a large group of people worked on that paper who suggested that 90% of the hoary bats would be lost in 50 years. But every year at the projects that I've looked at and helped, we're typically getting fewer hoary bats. And I heard the argument, oh, looks like the bats are learning. Well, that's outrageous. Yeah, maybe they're learning. Maybe there are fewer of them to get hit, right? Well, that's a very difficult argument to push either way, unless you have a lot of other evidence of surveying work, right? And now some of the surveying work suggests that, yes, we're having fewer and fewer bats. In Hawaii, I helped estimate the populations on various islands, and I think that wind energy is its highest risk. Definitely. So it's a good point, though. I think there are other species like Anthrozoas or pallid bats that I've spent a lot of time with that are susceptible to urbanization. And I think that things like light and sound to us aren't that bad, but to some of these bats, it impairs their ability to forage. Pallid bats come out later. They use sound, low-frequency sound, to locate their prey. They can hear a cricket walk in a completely dark room, like no lumens, in a room like this. And if you toss something out with a little catapult in the middle of the room, that bat will nail that thing in total darkness by its hearers. It can hear, I got involved in bats when I got a call from a woman who complained about slugs getting dropped in her dinner guest's hair. And I said, what? And she said, no, about 11 o'clock every Friday that we have a dinner party, which is once a month, there are these bats and they drop slugs into my guest's hair, and it's just horrible. And people don't even want to come out of the house after they eat because of these terrible slugs. And I told her, I have to see this. And sure enough, pallid bats were picking up slugs, taking them to the roost. They would chew them for a while, and I think in most cases reject them, and then they would drop from the roost. And I looked at that, but the bats were trying things out. How did they discover them? Slugs. Anybody. How do you find a slug? in darkness. If you're a pallid bat, how do you find a slug? You hear them. Because in fact, slugs have a radula, just like the beak of a bird. And when it's cutting through vegetation, you can hear that. I can put a slug in a jar that contains the sound. Let's say lettuce or almost anything that's, fresh produce. Cup my ear with that, and it's quite loud. And I don't think the pallid bat has any problem hearing slugs eating. And that's probably how they find it. So, getting back to the issue of these filters, urbanization is a huge filter for that species, I believe. And it's because of that and because of the light. They spend a lot of time on the ground. About a quarter of that population, it's interesting, a quarter of the population are crawlers. 3/4 of the population don't crawl. But the crawlers in particular eat flightless prey, and they'll crawl under leaves and into logs and things like that. It depends upon darkness, right? They need the cloak of darkness. And I've been in places in greater Los Angeles where it never gets dark. In fact, we were waiting at our net one time and we saw ravens. This is 10:30 at night. Ravens coming up from behind bats and taking them out. Yes. So the ravens had figured out, okay, you know what, if we're eating a little late tonight, we're going to do well. Yeah. So, but have the bats adapted to that? No, I think it's another layer of filtering where, certain parts of the population, certain species are going to be selected against. Okay. Any more questions? Thank you all. I produced a couple of podcasts. I didn't put the websites out there, but one is on organic wine podcast, and it talks a lot about using bats or encouraging bats if you have an organic farm or that setting. And the other one is more general natural history of bats. But if you just Google my name and then put podcasts, you'll both come up. Thank you.